Hello, welcome to Get Your Mind On. I'm Laurie Stoss. I'm sure you recall that expression, you have two ears and one mouth for a reason. Maybe one of your parents used to tell you that, or maybe it was one of those teachers in grade school when you had a tendency maybe to talk a little too much and they were really wanting you to listen. Now, some of us have that problem more than others, that some of us are better talkers and some of us are better listeners. As a matter of fact, when you think about all the things that we hear every day, when you wake up in the morning, from the time maybe you're up before your alarm and you hear those birds chirping, or when you hear that alarm go off, or have your radio or TV on, there's lots of sounds that we hear. So there's really a difference between hearing and listening. So today we're going to spend some time talking about listening. So what really is the difference between hearing and listening? Hearing are those sounds that are in the background that we may hear, but listening requires more. Listening is hearing, but it also requires more focus. More focus on everything from the verbals to nonverbals to the words to the emotions. There's more focus of a deeper understanding. Everybody really has the desire to be listened to or to be heard, and even to be understood. Sometimes you might hear that expression, are you listening to me, or do you hear me? Okay, so really when you think of that, step back first and think about, what does that really mean? So let's talk about listening. There's many times that it's very appropriate for us to think about listening. There's some of those conversations at work that we're having when we really do require full attention. There's lots of conversations that go on throughout our day, and statistics show that really we only hear 25 to 50% of what is said. Now again, that's hearing. That doesn't necessarily mean you may interpret and understand it, but that's pretty sad when you think about our day and think about the conversations that we have and maybe the directions that we're supposed to be hearing, the communication that we're supposed to be hearing, and knowing that really it could be less than half the conversations and the words are really being listened to. So when we think about that, I want you to think about why. Why do we not listen? Well, first, we have a number of distractions in our world today, especially with the increase in technology. Distractions are around us every day, whether that's our own head and the noises that we hear, or whether that's sitting, listening, and you're having a conversation with someone and the phone goes off, or your text comes through and has that beep or the vibration. Even if you have it on mute, you still hear the vibrating of your phone on the table. The other thing is, many people on their computers have that nice little ding when an email comes in. So that's another distraction that might be occurring. So there are a number of distractions around us. So we have to stop and really think about what those distractions are. So consider those distractions. And if you're in a conversation where you really need to be listening, you might want to minimize those distractions. Second is, many times we are not listening because we're too busy thinking about what we're going to say next, or we're too busy interrupting the other person. We're really not pausing and giving them full attention. So we need to really listen. So if you're having a conversation with someone, there's a part that you really need to listen mentally, right? Your head needs to really be listening to the words, as well as emotionally and physically, that you're watching. If it's an in-person conversation, you're watching the body language. You're watching how they're responding, if they're tense or if they're loosened up, or even that eye contact is very important to make sure you're listening. So maintain that eye contact, nod your head, that you're involved in the conversation. And those are all signs that show we're listening. But if we have a tendency to want to interrupt, sometimes, you're hearing them and you're agreeing with them and you're getting excited about the conversation and you want to say what you want to say, interruption is the worst thing, because you're probably thinking about what you're going to say next versus really hearing the words and listening to what they're saying. So a nice way to manage that is just, if you have your pencil or a pen and a piece of paper, just write a word. If you're afraid you're going to forget it. Sometimes people are afraid they're going to forget what they're going to say, so they interrupt. Just write a word, a trigger word that will remind you what that might be. So then you really won't worry about interrupting that person. The other thing to be involved in the conversation is, if you're afraid you're not listening, you might want to take some notes. I do that a lot when I'm having conversations with people, but I do have to be careful sometimes that I'm busy taking the notes more than I am, again, listening. I'm thinking about what they just said versus what they're saying right now. So sometimes if you do need to take notes during that conversation, even pause for a moment and say, hey, do you mind if I just capture that? That way you're really engaged in that conversation with them. The other thing is silence. Silence is really important. Sometimes we have a tendency to not like silence. And when you think about the letters in listen and silent, they're the same. And sometimes that pause, if someone says something and you're really wanting to think about it, that's really good to engage in just a pause. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we just hate that pause, but really it's that processing. Some people need a little bit more time to process, and you might just say, I just want to process that for a moment. That way you're really listening and they're really appreciating that because, again, they're being heard. So that's another thing to do, is to sit and listen by pausing and having a little bit of silence. So we all know what's important, and we really want to be listened, and we really want to be understood as people. I was with, a friend and a peer the other day, and we were in his office, and it was, a quiet, focused time so we could have a good conversation. And having that conversation with him, and it was like every few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, the phone would buzz, the vibration, and he'd look at it. And the phone would vibrate and he'd look at it. And I just didn't feel like the conversation, we were connecting very well and I was being heard. So sometimes that might happen to you. So whether this is us listening or somebody else listening to us, how do we manage that? So the first thing to do is first think about, just pause. Pause, and if there, something comes on their phone, you don't know, maybe there is something they've been waiting for and they just didn't say that to you and there is something important. Just pause and stop talking and let them deal with their text or whatever they have to do at the time. And if that continues on, the second thing might be just to say, is there a better time maybe that we can connect, especially if this is a conversation? Would you like me to come back a little bit later? That would allow them the opportunity. You're nicely saying, I don't feel like I'm being heard, and you're giving them the respect that maybe they do have something going on that they need to tend to. So I think that's really important. So really think about that situation, whether that's you in that position of you're not being heard, that sometimes when we're not listening to people and we're distracted because we have things going on, that's how they're feeling. And that we might be feeling the same thing when we're talking with others. So if somebody does come into you, especially at work, and they have something to talk to you about, you might even say, hey, I just need a minute to finish something up so I can give you my full attention. And that's a very respectful, conversation to be had. So really, when we think about this, there's lots of different things to consider when we're listening, and listening is so important. So let's think about the positive charge for this week. One is stop and think about hearing versus listening. When are there times that we should just be hearing things, right? Because they're just noise, or it's maybe a song that we're listening to, or we hear that dog whimper. It might catch our eye or catch our ear and something we need to tend to. But there's times when we really need to be in that fine-tuned listening because of business meeting, maybe our kids or our spouse. So think this week about hearing versus listening, and observe yourself. And maybe sit in one of those conversations that you really should be listening, and take the time to tune in to utilizing both the nonverbals and verbals. The next thing for positive charge is really stop and think of, when you're in a conversation, the pause of not interrupting. So observe yourself and understand if you are an interruptive person and have a tendency to want to interrupt during a conversation. Just be aware of that and watch this week for any interruptions. And if you are doing that, take some time to track, over the next week or two, of just trying a tool like writing that keyword down so you can really listen and focus. The most basic and powerful thing we can do is listen. The best gift that we can give each other is really just our full attention. So think about that this week, and know that in order to build those relationships at work, build those relationships with our family, our spouses, our partners, and our children and our friends, are really just to give them that gift of listening. Thanks for joining us today, and remember to get your mind on.